Secretary Reed. They almost got you first, Alan. Alan, actually, what I'm doing here is, Alan said it's a dull season, and so he sent for the Gary Gilmore of the Pentagon. I thought, let me just make a couple of remarks. You have my full statement, and then we'll take all the questions that you would like. The Department of the Air Force today awarded contracts to Rockwell International, General Electric, and the Boeing Company for initial production of the B-1 bomber. All three contracts include clauses which limit the government's obligation to a cumulative rate of $87 million per month through February 1st, 1977, in compliance with the fiscal year 1977 Defense Appropriations Act. The contracts are also structured to enable the Air Force to limit total government liability month by month through June 1977. Those contracts, the contract to Rockwell was for about $562 million, depending on how the incentive fees turn out. The General Electric contract was $79 million. The Boeing contract was about $64 million. The Defense Systems Acquisition Review Committee completed its review of this program this morning. It made its recommendations to the Secretary of Defense. The resulting memorandum from Secretary Rumsfeld to me has been furnished to you. In preparing for this decision, which is a very weighty one for the Air Force, and for that matter the Department of Defense, I wanted to assemble some independent committees to help in that matter. One was a committee, technical assessment committee, which was chaired by Professor Cortlandt Perkins, who is president of the National Academy of Engineering. I asked him to examine the question of technical readiness and advise me outside of regular DoD channels what he thought. His conclusions were, the conclusions of that committee were essentially that there were no apparent technical problems that would preclude production as planned, a view that is also held within the Department of Defense. At the same time, I also asked three knowledgeable outsiders to review all reasonable alternatives to the B-1. In particular, the question I really asked, the key question, was whether forces, which include some B-1s, impose the greatest target damage per dollar expended. The members of the panel were Messrs. David, May, and Nitze, gentlemen who I've known for some time and whose judgment I have a great deal of respect. Their conclusions were that the B-1 should be procured for inclusion in the force. The text of those last two reports have also been furnished to you today. I think that the decision to produce the B-1 is sound. The aircraft represents 15 years of study, design, development, fabrication, exhaustive ground testing, exhaustive flight testing. 4 aircraft have been included in the program. 3 of them are flying. The first aircraft flew in December of 1974. I think the success of the program can really be summarized by this chart of accumulated flying hours. When we first considered the program and what sort of milestones should we achieve in order to feel confident in proceeding with the production of this aircraft, we concluded that we ought to have at least 250 hours in the air, preferably about 300, before we could comfortably proceed. Now, flight hours are not in themselves enough of a measure. The question is covering what sort of tests, and there's a little summary here. A copy of this chart has been furnished to you of what was done during the flight test program. But the point is, the flight test program has proceeded extremely well, that really beginning this year, all the aircraft were flying, and the number of hours now exceed 400. Supporting the flight test program has been a very extensive ground testing program, wind tunnel tests, component tests, static tests, fatigue tests, and a chart that many of you have seen, although we did not furnish it, is this, which illustrates the fatigue test program compared to other aircraft. What we have done is taken other aircraft, both military and commercial, and normalized them to a line here, which is the initial first production delivery. And then we've shown where in the history of those aircraft did the fatigue testing occur. What this shows is that those of you who have flown to Los Angeles were participating in the fatigue test program at the time. That the B-1 program, however, has been structured so that we have already concluded 2 lifetimes of fatigue testing and will have 4 lifetimes, at least 2.5 years before the delivery of the first production aircraft. Now, given the background of all this testing, the question still remains as to what are the expected production costs. The Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretaries of Defense and I have all reviewed that question, and we conclude that the SPO has a demonstrated record of management in the R&D program, that the very thorough early testing that I've just been talking about here will pay off in the production phase. We therefore conclude that the B-1 program can and should be completed for a total program cost, which means research, development, test, and evaluation, plus procurement, in then-year dollars, which means the dollars in the years they are spent, of $22.8 billion, which is the current SAR before Congress. Nonetheless, we did examine the sensitivity of the force and its cost effectiveness to changes in B-1 unit costs that could arise from, for instance, different learning curves, program stretch out, or reduced buys. As example, this chart here, which has also been furnished to you, is a comparison of the effectiveness of various forces if B-1 procurement costs should rise by as much as 25%. This is an extract of the Joint Strategic Bomber Study, which was done under the aegis of DDR&E 2 years ago for the Congress, the GAO essentially blessed as far as substance, as far as procedures were concerned, updated to look at what the costs currently are. And in order to try to keep it unclassified, it's cost per weapon delivered on target, normalized to the program we envision, for 5 alternatives that have been looked at fairly commonly. On the left, Force 2 is essentially what we propose to do in our program, to purchase a total of 240 B-1s, resulting in 210 what are known as unit equipment aircraft, keep the B-52Hs and tankers. The second column, Force 4, was a program wherein we would take the B-52s, re-engine them, update them, do everything we could to extend the life of the B-52s that we have, which results in our buying fewer B-1s. The third column is to buy a wide-body aircraft, a 747, and equip it with cruise missiles. The fourth column is to take the FB-111s and stretch them, do everything we can to give them more range, and keep some B-52Hs. And the last column was to keep all the B-52Gs and Hs we have as long as possible, which therefore results in buying fewer B-1s. And the conclusion to me, and it was the DSARC's finding as well, is that the B-1 remains the most cost-effective alternative for modernizing the strategic bomber force, and that it should proceed to production. And the hatch marks here shows the effect of being off by 25% in the costs of the B-1 aircraft. Although I'm convinced of the need for the B-1, I'm certainly not unmindful of the congressional limits on government obligations until February of 1977. Furthermore, I appreciate the fact that the new administration will want to preserve several options as it assesses the overall strategic picture. As a result, we have structured a contractual program which will impose a limit on government obligations of a cumulative $87 million per month, not only until February 1st, but through the end of June. We have arranged for future tooling costs to be covered by options rather than the basic contract, and the contractual program is summarized by this chart, which we also furnished to you. And let me explain what this is. Obviously, this is months. This solid black line is the obligation limit imposed in the appropriation bill passed by Congress. We have extended out here a dotted line, which is not in the statute, but which we felt was a reasonable upper limit to impose on ourselves. The total government liability, which includes various expenditures, non-cancelable commitments, capital buybacks in the event of early termination and so forth, is as set forth in this solid black line here. So if the question is, what is the cost of the program, what is the total government obligation for any day of any week, well, you put a ruler down here and go up to this line, and this tells you the government's obligation, total obligation for termination as of that time. Because, of course, those are obligations, not expenditures, this is the rate at which funds will actually be spent. This line does not end up here because, of course, we have fully funded this contract. The contract with Rockwell in particular runs for 3 years, and so these funds will actually be obligated out early in the next fiscal year. Secondly, not in here are things that would begin to be purchased out here in this part of the year, spares, engineering change orders, and so forth. Let me return to the basic reason for the B-1. The Soviet Union has undertaken a broad and deep effort in the expansion of their strategic forces. To the Congressional Budget Office, this build-up raised, quote, questions concerning the ultimate intentions of the present regime, unquote. To me, there is every indication the Soviets are driving for strategic superiority by the early 1980s. The B-1 is the strategic initiative that can redress that imbalance by the early 80s. It would be irresponsible not to initiate the B-1 production at this time. We are, therefore, doing so. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Secretary, could you give us a figure on the cost, the estimated cost of these first 3 B-1s?
The cost of the first 3 B-1s,
Non-recurring engineering tooling, that sort of thing.
that really depends how many other, what you do with the tooling. If you procure these 3 aircraft only and then terminate the program, to a rough approximation, you have to take this year's appropriation of $1,049,000 and divide that by 3 aircraft and assume the government gets back some machine tools which it may use in some other capacity. Conversely, if you proceed with the program, the unit costs, General Martin, are about
Procurement unit cost is $76 and $54 million.
for these 3 aircraft. If we
With these 3, it would be the order of $100 million.
these 3 aircraft, if you continue with the program, then the question really is what is the cost of all the aircraft you buy. But to a first approximation, about $100 million and $76.
Secretary, why couldn't...
For these 3 aircraft, if you continue with the program. If you terminate the program at the end of the year, you take what you spent for the year and divide it by 3. Yes, sir.
Secretary, why couldn't this decision have waited until the new administration took office?
Well, if we protected the President-elect's options to proceed with production and to try to do so in a efficient and economic fashion, I think we would end up doing essentially what we've done here, whether we do it by extending the existing contract a month at a time or placing this contract. The obligation of the government was about the same. As we discussed this subject last summer, we said that one way or another, if you fund this until the 1st of February, the government's obligations at that time would be somewhere between $110 and $150 million. It turns out it probably is about $140 million. The President-elect and his administration will undoubtedly want to conduct a careful review of the U.S. strategic programs, the manned bomber being a very central part of that triad. The B-1 in particular, in the context of the intelligence that we have available concerning the strategic nuclear balance, is very important. So we've tried to structure a approach which includes month-by-month funding that will provide the President-elect with the broadest possible range of options.
The 25% increase, wasn't that amount that Rockwell came in with as their position in the initial negotiations that they needed?
Well, I'm not familiar with their initial position, and secondly, that's the Rockwell contract is for this year, Lot 1, which is 3 aircraft.
An estimate for the total program.
That tells you where you start in cost, but
Where did you get 25% from?
that sort of seemed like a good number to pick.
Picked it out of the air? Wait a minute. You just picked it out of the air?
To use my judgment as to look at things doubling. I don't think that the SPO can be proven that wrong by the series of events. The point is that we do not want to make a decision that is dependent on cost estimates being accurate to 3 significant figures. And so a 25% increase, if a decision is still right, even if you're off by 25%, that seems like a reasonable sort of things to do.
Did it come from the negotiation?
No.
Secretary, how much did you have to pay to keep the options open? I assume that the contractors weren't very enthusiastic about going into a month-by-month arrangement.
in the context of the funding involved here, really very little. The cost of this sort of a contractual relationship is an awful lot of legal time, subsequently an awful lot of accounting and bookkeeping time so that we know what our obligations are every month, but that this program really is at the rate at which we would have spent money had there been no limitations of any sort. And so what we have imposed is an administrative burden on the system to keep track of exactly how much we have obligated every month, to know where we are during this transition period, but then other than additional administrative costs and negotiating time and effort on the front end, that the program has no substantive additional cost because of these options, these limits.
Was there any effort made to get any feedback from the President-elect on his possible feelings about the development of this program before you made this decision this morning?
Well, the President-elect has been here. He met with the Secretary of Defense. He did not raise the issue. Before awarding the contract, we did advise Mr. Stedman, the transition officer at the Pentagon. The President, the current President, is the President until January 20th, not only in the authority he has, but far more importantly, as far as I'm concerned, the responsibility of doing what's right. I think the Pentagon is a nonpartisan place. We defend all the people. We have had no signals that we are embarked on a wrong course. On the other hand, the President-elect is not obligated to so signal. But the point is, we did, and we have, and we will continue to work with the transition team and the new administration, and when they are in power, I support them fully.
Did you discuss the alternatives with Mr. Stedman that they might be investigating regarding the B-1, alternatives between full production and scrapping the program?
I do not know what conversations his staff have had in the building that we did not, Mr. Stedman did not sit in on the DSARC deliberations. He was advised of the decision before the contract award.
But in your consultations, did you discuss,
no, I did not.
alternatives?
I did not consult Mr. Stedman. The Secretary of Defense did.
What hindrance, if any, did the congressional limitation impose on the Air Force as it decided its go or no-go production decision?
Other than the tremendous amount of time consumed by the legal staffs, essentially none.
What is the inflation rate applied to the program for the years after 1979?
The inflation rates were published in the SAR, but they are essentially in the 8%, 8.5% until about 1980, and they dropped to 4% in the 80s. 40% after 1980. If you ask me the next question, do I believe that? The answer is absolutely not. And therefore, that's why we have SARs, that if you would like to project what inflation is going to be, then you can develop revised costs. But in terms of if you keep the value of the dollar fixed, we have settled on what we think the cost of the program will be.
What would be the monetary cost of keeping this program in research and development stage?
Well, the R&D appropriation for fiscal 77 is about $460 million. But that's not the question. The question is, why would you do that? If you do it because you want to produce airplanes sometime, then the question is, what is the cost of turning it all off on November 30th and then starting it again sometime in the summer? The answer, as we said last year, was an addition of about $500 million to have everybody laid off and the whole drill closed down by last Tuesday, and to then start it again sometime during this spring.
From what you said about the inflation rate, you believe that 4% after 1980 is not realistic, and that the program, the cost eventually will go up because of inflation after that.
That's not what I said. I said I don't believe it's 4%. That I'm not in the business of projecting inflation. I would refer you to the Council.
That'll be higher.
I didn't say that. I just said I didn't. 4.0 is two significant figures, and you all decide what you think it is, and that's why we publish SARs.
Was it cost? Is that the main reason for not waiting until the new administration came in?
To wind the whole thing down, for two reasons. One is to wind the whole thing down, and then to start it all again in the spring adds $500 million to the cost of the program for no net forward motion. That's a couple $1 million an airplane. However, the more practical reason is I am currently the Secretary of the Air Force. I have spent much of this year considering what the Soviets are up to. I cannot imagine a succeeding Secretary of Defense or Secretary of the Air Force concluding that we should not add some B-1 aircraft to the strategic force. Now, a legitimate question is, at what rate do we produce those? That is a question that we were planning to address this next summer in putting together the 1979 budget, because the first time you have to commit yourself to the tooling for production rate is with the fiscal 79 funding. And secondly, what should that force size be? That is a function of what the Soviets are doing by 1980, and for that matter, SALT agreements, if we can achieve some. We do not have to decide on a force size until the summer of 1979, when the 1981 budget is being put together.
Do you still plan a 244 plane program?
Yes, I do, but it's not clear my views count in the long haul, but that seems to me a reasonable program. But that is clearly, whether it is this administration or any other, how many aircraft is dependent on what you see the Soviets doing in the 1980s. My personal view is that by 1980 it will be very apparent that the Soviets have completed deploying a whole new generation of ICBMs. They will have completed MIRVing those systems. They will have built a great many backfire bombers, and that the United States people, and certainly its government, will be very sharply concerned about that. And I personally would expect a increased deployment of weapons unless we have a SALT agreement, which I hope we will have.
Did you ask the transitions people specifically what their plans were for B-1? That would have been much simpler for your own decision-making.
The Secretary of Defense is in charge of those conversations, and I was not there when he met with the President-elect, nor was I there when he met with Mr. Stedman. And I think that that's a question you ought to address to him and the transition team. Yes.
One step further on that, then. Did the Defense Secretary give you any guidance on what the next administration plans?
Yes. The guidance he gave was that we have been discussing this, thinking about it intensely for the year, certainly this last month, and certainly all week, that the question of what is right and wrong for the country was the uppermost issue in his mind. That if he had had guidance or inclinations that this was a waste of the taxpayers' money, I am quite sure he would not have proceeded. That is also colored, however, by the issue of what is right for the country and what options will the next president have when he becomes president.
Can you clarify for us that it says here in the blue top press release that in consultation with President Ford, Secretary Rumsfeld today authorized the Air Force to execute the production contracts on the B-1. I would take it from that that was a clear endorsement by Mr. Ford to proceed, but perhaps you can elaborate on just what the President's attitude was today forward going into this program on production.
Oh, I think the custom is that you ask those questions of the President or Mr. Nesson. And again, I was not party to those conversations. That the President is familiar with the aspects of the decision, supports and encourages the decision, and for his exact position, I think you probably ought to ask the White House.
He endorsed the decision.
Yes.
Well, is he for the full program?
What do you mean by the full program?
Well, as you say here, beyond just this
It is my
transitional program, is you're for all out beyond that. Is he?
This administration had a plan for a 244 aircraft buy, and that plan had developed over the last 2 years when he was in office. That his exact position, I would have to refer you to the White House, but my conversations with him and his adoption of the budget clearly implied a endorsement of the B-1 program as we see it. But I want to say again, 244 aircraft is what currently seems like a reasonable force. You do not have to decide that until late 1979, at which time you will have a much clearer view as to what the Soviets are up to. It is my view that the threat will be far more serious at the time. Conversely, in the summer of 1979, it may be that it will seem prudent to cut back to the 2 or 3 wing force.
Secretary, did I
How many would that
understand you
be?
to say you did not think there would be a SALT agreement?
No, quite the contrary. I said I hope there will be one.
Mr. Secretary, what would be the consequences of keeping this program in the R&D and testing stage for, we'll say, another year?
Well, first of all, as I said, there is a cost of about $500 million to lay all the production people off, terminate the long lead procurement. A lot of the items that we procured long lead are forgings, for instance, where the long lead times are at least a couple of years to get the dies made and so forth. To wind all that down, stop that work, and then start it again sometime this year, we estimated to be of the order of $500 million. Secondly, there is a matter of added inflation. That can be argued that that's not a real cost because those are funny dollars. There is the logical question of why. There is no greater things to be learned from testing, that this aircraft is the most thoroughly tested aircraft. It has had the most thorough test program imposed on it of any aircraft that has gone into production. The two charts I indicated, one of flying hours and the other fatigue testing. Therefore, the question is why do that? If it's for the sake of indecision, the major decisions as to what rate you want to produce them and how many you want to buy are decisions you don't have to make until this summer and the summer of 1979, respectively.
Sir, in connection with the negotiations between the Air Force and Rockwell to limit the government's obligations until June, is it your understanding that Mr. Carter has the flexibility to put off the decision until June, or must he decide, if he decides not to go ahead with it, must he decide that by February 1st?
No, what we've said is the meter is running at this rate, and that whenever one sits around and decides what does the meter say today, if I make a decision, well, you look at what is today and look at this.
The question is, how much flexibility does Mr. Carter have, in fact? How much time does he have to make the decision? Under the congressional mandate, it was my understanding that if he cancels the program, he must do that by February 1st. If he doesn't act by then, the program automatically goes forward.
No, that's not what the mandate said. There was a lot of amendments, but what really the Congress passed was language in the appropriations bill which said the Air Force will not obligate funds at a rate to exceed $87 million a month cumulatively, starting from the beginning of the fiscal year, which is this line right here. And it says as of February 1st, the Air Force may obligate all the funds. Now, in fact, I think the President has 3 option times. During the last week of January, he can drastically restructure the program. I think that decision is probably subject to a rescission bill by Congress, the approval of Congress of some sort of a rescission bill, because the Congress did vote funds, and all they did was say don't spend them all on the first day of the fiscal year. Secondly, during his first 100 days, he can reevaluate the program and forward any changes to Congress with his fiscal year 78 budget amendments. I assume any new president will have budget amendments, and generally they need to be up there before the April 15th concurrent resolution deadline. Thirdly, during the summer of 1977, he can reevaluate the program in the context of what should our strategic forces be, a reevaluation that is, I think, very appropriate. And at that time, he can decide on production rate. And the force size does not need to be decided until the summer of 1979. So his options are continuous. There is no deadline other than the fact that the meter is running, and that chart tells you what rate the meter is running.
What's the minimum amount that we have to have now?
The minimum amount of
B-1s in production.
What you have to have, what I've said is the current program we envision is a purchase of 240 aircraft. We own 4 R&D aircraft, which is a total of 244. But those do not get delivered until the mid-80s. The first IOC is 1982, full operational capability is 1986. Whether that's what you have to have is a function of what the Soviets are doing and whether we have a SALT agreement, and therefore that number gets decided, and it would have in a continuation of the Ford administration in the summer of 1979.
The appropriation covered purchase of long lead materials for the second lot of aircraft. I assume that's in this.
The contract, or the contract package, contracting is a complex business, but the contract in the broader sense that was awarded to Rockwell covers 3 aircraft, long lead for 8 more aircraft, just as last year we had long lead for these 3, and initial tooling and production engineering. The contract also has options, which we can then exercise with fiscal 78 and 79 money, if we wish to, the Air Force wishes to, for the additional procurement of tooling and production engineering. One of the reasons the negotiations took so long is we really thought that the cost of the tooling ought to be defined, and we shouldn't just embark and then sail off and let somebody else worry about what it's going to cost.
Mr. Secretary, as one who's spent a lot of time analyzing the options here, supposing in his wisdom Mr. Carter does cancel the B-1, what would be your recommendation as the fallback? Specifically, when the F-111 was analyzed, there was a proposal way back to put a plug in it to make it a long-range bomber. And what kind of fallback option would you recommend, having studied the problem?
I want to put that chart back up again. Let's just talk about these. My recommendation is that is going to be extremely foolish, because the Soviet Union is moving in a very broad and determined fashion, and to do anything other than to be prepared for the challenges we're going to have in the 80s is very ill-advised. To review these forces, what's more, the force that we recommend is 240 production aircraft, keep the B-52Hs, and equip the Hs with cruise missiles, so forth.
Could you give us the other numbers there? You've given us the 244 for the first
Well,
option.
I cannot do that because that makes it all classified. I can give you the B-1 numbers that go with that. I guess that's what counts. Force 2 is, the numbers are 210 unit equipment. That's what goes out and drops bombs in case there's a war. The other 30 aircraft are in the garage, if you will, in the pipeline. Force 4, the second column here, involved about 180 UE. And taking the money that would have been expended on buying other B-1s to modifying B-52s to create what we call a notional aircraft, a B-52I. That means new engines and the other things that have been reviewed in the studies.